Hello, everyone, and welcome to Core in Action Semester 3. This is our first session of our third semester. The Core in Action series will introduce us to all of the basic concepts and ideas and theories, and also the empirical work underlying the enactive approach to cognitive science and understanding the mind. So we're into our third semester now, which is also the second semester of our close reading of essentially the seminal text, The Embodied Mind, which introduced us to the enactive approach. And we are jumping straight into the middle for this one. I think we've seen many returning faces, and if you've been with us from the beginning, you're very welcome back, and we're very happy to see you and looking forward to the conversations. If you are with us just starting off, obviously I will recommend that you go back through the recordings of the previous sessions. There is a lot of value there, and there's a lot of sort of rich material to get stuck into. But as it happens, this is also a good place to start, partly because of the rather perverse nature of the enactive approach to like jumping in the middle of things and swimming your way out from there, but also partly because this is as Amy put it, this is a hinge point in the text of the embodied mind itself as well. So our speaker for this evening will be Sebastian Vörös, who we are very lucky to have with us. I'll introduce him in a little bit more detail later on in just a moment. But just as we've sort of one or two more people arriving, we can sort of take a moment to sort of pause and reflect. This is a chapter, the chapter entitled Cartesian Anxiety. And it's a good point to join if this is the first time, the first session that you have joined in with us, because it is in essence in the book a pause for reflection on the three parts of the book that have come before. So I said actually way back in the first session on chapter 1 that the embodied mind isn't just a theoretical work of cognitive science, that it is in part a manifesto. It's a call to revolution within cognitive science as well. And in his 2021 commentary and introduction to the Communist Manifesto, quite a different thing, the author China Miéville briefly describes manifestos as a genre of writing, drawing from other writers as well, such as Marjorie Perloff and Julian Hanna. And I quote, there's a sort of a long quotation here, which includes some quotations from others, but it captures a sense of things nicely that I think we see in the present text. So, a manifesto embraces contradiction. It is unafraid of paradox. It delights in outrage. It provokes and insists and jokes, and it's quite serious. It oscillates between registers. It is, as Marjorie Perloff puts it, not quite theory or poetry, but a space between the traditional modes and genres. Manifestos are flippant and sincere, prickly and smooth, logical and absurd, material and immaterial, shallow and profound, fleeting and permanent, serious and ridiculous, unstable texts in the extreme. They are theatrical. Performance is part of the manifesto's materiality. So I suspect if you've been reading with us up to this point, and also if, as I said, you've been jumping in, particularly in this section, some of this might sound or feel a little familiar. There's certainly the reveling in instability is played to the fore in chapter 7. I think all of these characteristics are very much on display. Varela, Thompson and Rosch pausing to reflect on the implications of the first three parts of the book. Over the first 6 chapters, we've seen all of the traditional foundations of knowledge of ourselves and the world made unsettled and questionable. Symbols and representations, neurological information processing, the self, none of these things has been left with us as a suitable foundation for knowledge either of ourselves or the world around us. And therefore, we might be feeling a little bit sort of unsettled and nervous as to what it is we should actually be doing from this point on. So in chapter 7, the authors explicitly recognize this, and they take some time to talk about how this might make us feel, and give the appropriate title to the chapter, the anxiety that comes with it. And they kind of point out that this anxiety is born of the assumptions of Western science and knowledge traditions that just normally go unquestioned, but have been shown in the light of empirical work in cognitive science to actually be fairly contingent, to be dependent on the kinds of backgrounds that we're coming from. And crucially, what the authors don't do is reassure us that there is solid ground to come. And so to a certain extent, rather than settling our nerves, they just tell us to get over it. But I guess reassure us that rather than solid ground to come, there is the confidence to deal with this kind of instability. Right? They push the radical viewpoint, forcing us to face the anxiety rather than trying to remove it or offering a simple fix or a salve. There's ways we can get over this. We don't need to find new fixed ground on which to stand. We need to get over that need to realize that the anxiety is just not necessary. That knowledge can be characterized not by its rigidity and fixedness, but its pragmatic dynamism. So we need new tools to do this. We need new habits of thought in particular. We'll need new methods to get over this anxiety. And it is precisely these that the next few chapters of the book aim to provide the basis on, to start orienting us within this rather disoriented state in which we find ourselves. And gradually over the next 5 chapters, we see this beginning to find. I always love Susan Oyama's way of sort of putting this, which was, if you have no solid ground to stand on, you can at least learn how to swim. So with that, we will move toward digging into the chapter in a little bit more depth. And our guide in this process of disorientation is the wonderful Sebastian Vörös, who is an associate professor of philosophy at the Faculty of Arts in the University of Ljubljana in Slovenia. His research interests encompass philosophy of science, epistemology, phenomenology, and philosophy of religion. He's an author of a book whose title I will not attempt to pronounce in Slovene, my apologies, but The Images of the Unimaginable is its translation, in which Sebastian investigates the phenomenon of mystical experiences from neuroscientific, phenomenological, and nosological perspectives. He has edited and co-edited numerous articles and special issues centered on embodiment and enaction and neurophenomenology. And if you're a fan and sort of a citizen of the Mind and Life YouTube channel and events, you will remember his superb hosting of the Vörös series from about middle of last year, wasn't that right? Or maybe a year before. I'm losing track of all time, so my apologies on that one. In addition, Sebastian, who's 2 years ago, thanks, Joanna. Additionally, Sebastian has translated several important philosophical texts into Slovene, in addition to works by Antonio Damasio, Daniel Dennett, William James, Alfred North Whitehead, and has also translated and edited The Embodied Mind. So finally, he is the head of the Transdisciplinary Institute in the Making of Metanoia, and is currently, I presume these are his words, painfully and arduously writing a book on the philosophical and scientific work of Francisco Varela. He is a person with an exquisite richness of knowledge of the material with which we are working, and I am very much looking forward to his guidance and presentation on chapter 7 of the Embodied Mind, bring us into the Cartesian anxiety.
So hello everyone, and thank you for the kind invitation and for the kind introductory words. I will now attempt to share my slide with you. Hopefully nothing will go awry, although you know how it is with Zoom. We've tested everything, and yet things have a way of taking on a life of their own. I hope that you can see yeah, everything's okay now? Yeah. Okay. So the topic of today's session is chapter 7 from the book The Embodied Mind. And it has already been pointed out that this is a very important chapter. It is, in a certain sense, as it has been mentioned, a pivotal chapter, but it's also a somewhat fragmentary chapter, a chapter that in some ways is underdeveloped. So what I mean by that several terms are introduced in this particular chapter, which are not really developed properly. They're either developed later on or not at all. So the reason why it's so important and why it's so pivotal is because it's a connecting chapter. It's a chapter that connects the previous 3 parts of the work, which might be said to present a critical part, so a critique of certain approaches that the authors want to distance themselves from. Between the next 2 parts, the parts 4 and 5, where the authors provide the positive account. And as you've probably seen, it's more like a teaser or an appetizer than a full-blown chapter. It kind of hints to a lot of things, a lot of issues, a lot of interesting topics, but it doesn't fully develop them. So my main goal in this presentation is twofold. I will, first of all, try to provide a brief and selective recap of the path that has already been traversed. So I will try to provide the overall background that I think is really, really important for everyone who attempts to read this book. And also some of the key points that have been laid out in the previous chapters. Then I will present the chapter itself. I will focus on the 3 main topics: the question of representation, the question that Marek so nicely delineated of Cartesian anxiety, and the topic of the middle way, or steps towards a middle way. And towards the end, I will just very briefly provide a short glimpse ahead as to what follows and how what we will be saying today is directly relevant to that. So this is the book that we're dealing with, just so that you check if you've been reading the right book. And The Embodied Mind itself is I think we can all agree, an extremely fascinating book. And like all fascinating books, it has a dragon in it. What I mean by that, let me explain. So you've all heard about this phrase, I presume, or at least many of you, hic sunt dracones. It's Latin for "here be dragons." In the medieval times, this phrase was sometimes used to designate certain uncharted, dangerous, unexplored territories. Now, the phrase itself is a bit of an anachronism. It hasn't really been used that often. If I'm not mistaken, there are only 2 manuscripts where it actually can be found. A more common phrase was hic sunt leones, here be lions, but the idea is the same. So there are certain regions, certain areas, certain domains that are dangerous, and we shouldn't be tackling them. We shouldn't be exploring them. And we all, in a certain sense, have several maps in our lives that have these areas. So we all have our hic sunt dracones, here be dragons regions, in different domains and regions of life. Now, the thing is that this particular representation of a dragon doesn't necessarily have to be scary. So these regions where dragons live don't necessarily have to be hidden by hideous images of creatures like these. They can be actually something that is very commonplace, something that is very prototypical, very something that we find very, very normal. In fact, one could argue that for the most part, it is precisely that which goes without saying, which is evident, commonsensical, and obvious, which represents these particular regions where there are dragons. So there are those domains in our maps of reality that we don't want to tackle. They seem self-evident. And the idea is that if you decide to look at them closely, if you decide to question the self-evidentiality of these regions, well, bad things might happen. The whole world might fall apart. So you don't want to mess with these regions. However, we all know that where there are dragons, there's also gold. So like William James said of the regions of the mystical experiences, these are the domains where the snake and the seraph lay side by side. So the question arises, if we were to tackle these domains, domains that are designated by here be dragons, would the world really fall apart? or would merely the map of the world fall apart? So would it turn out that the map that we're having is off, and this might maybe necessitate a development of a different map? So just something that we need to remember: no dragons, no magic. Now, why am I talking about dragons and magic? What has this got to do with the embodied mind? If we look at the front cover of the embodied mind, we have a nice picture of a tree. So I will use this particular example to try and make a point. We live in a world that is a very specific. So what our world is a scientific, even a scientistic world. Yeah, we live in a scientific or a scientistic age, and science, for better or worse, is nowadays the greatest, the most influential epistemic force and authority. And I'm saying this as a fact, not as a normative statement. So I'm not trying to make any normative assessments of this particular judgments. I have my views on this, but this is just something that is a factual claim. And science itself has developed a very specific map of the world. And as we have been able to see in the past several centuries, this map has proven to be extremely useful in many ways. However, as all maps, it also has its own distinct dragons. And this brings me to this particular photo. Now, imagine that you are in a place that is somewhat similar to this, in a forest of some sorts, in a place that is somehow in one way or another meaningful to you. So you find yourself in the midst of a forest, maybe a place that is important, that was important to you when you were younger, or something that you frequent regularly, or something that, you know, just carries certain important memories for one reason or another. All of a sudden, once you're in this particular forest, you find yourself amidst a specific ambience, amidst a specific tapestry of colors, of sounds, of scents. And all these colors, scents, and sounds, they create a certain reality before you, a certain presence, which has a certain depth, a certain texture, and is imbued with meaning. All these structures that you see, all these qualities that I've just mentioned, they have a certain meaning for you. They evoke certain memories. They stir certain images, provoke certain thoughts. And this plethora of thoughts, images, memories, and what you see, all of them become intermeshed into one thick whole, which is just permeated, as I said, imbued with profound meaning. However, there's a problem, and this problem is nicely encapsulated in this quote by Merleau-Ponty. The real world, says Merleau-Ponty, is not this world of light and color. It is not the fleshy spectacle which passes before my eyes. It consists rather of the waves and particles which science tells us lie behind these sensory illusions. In other words, we have, in our time, grown accustomed to thinking of a world in a very specific way, a way which is at odds with how the world seems or appears to us. And if pressed, if we had to decide which of the two domains is more real, the world of atoms, and I'm using atoms here basically as an example of the simplest constituent of reality. It doesn't have to be atoms proper, yeah? So atoms or experience, many people would probably opt for atoms. They would say that the atoms are what is real, and experience, well, it is somehow real, but maybe not so much. There's something problematic. Or if they wouldn't opt for this particular possibility, they would at least have serious issues simply wholeheartedly accepting that experience, so the world as it is given to us in our consciousness, in our lived experience, is what constitutes reality. So in a certain sense, and as the authors point out in the book, we are living in some sort of a schizophrenic worldview. And I mean here schizophrenia in the literal sense of the term, namely schizein and phreno, from phrenos, which means a split mind. We are of a split mind, of a our world is a dual-minded, a split-minded world. What I'm saying is not particularly novel, and it has been basically something that's been brought up on several occasions by several authors, and it's almost like a shadow that's been lurking around the contemporary scientific Weltanschauung worldview. This particular problem, this schizophrenia that I've mentioned, has two dimensions. And I'm going to use two terms here. Don't be disheartened by them, be frightened by them. They are pretty straightforward. The first term was introduced by the philosopher Alfred North Whitehead, and it is called bifurcation. So basically a split. And it basically says that there is a certain split in our reality, namely the reality that we have access to, the reality of lived experience, is the one that is believed to be unreal or illusory in some sense, whereas the physical reality, which is in principle inaccessible to me in my experience, is the one that is real. So what is real is inaccessible, and what is unreal is accessible. And this is the bifurcation, where you have this split between what is sometimes referred to as the subjective domain and the objective domain, domain of experience and domain of science. Domain of science, inaccessible in my lived experience, yet this is what constitutes reality. On the other hand, subjective domain, which is given to me, but it's not real. However, this is not merely an intellectual problem. It is not merely an epistemological problem. It is not a problem of knowing, okay? It is not a sophisticated intellectual Sudoku. It has much deeper roots. It has deep, profound existential implications. And this brings us to the second aspect. This is the notion of disenchantment. And this was the term that was introduced by Weber, sociologist Max Weber. And it basically says that the world, the scientific world, has become disenchanted. What does Weber mean by that? Well, all those qualities such as a value, significance, meaning, and so on and so forth, they basically turn out to be non-existent, illusory, secondary. Because if reality is consists of what physics tells us it consists of, there is simply no room for this. All of these qualities are simply, in one way or another, our own subjective constructs, and as such, relative, particular, and ultimately not grounded in anything that we could call real or significant. So we basically live in these islands of self-constructed values and meaning and significances, which ultimately are not anchored in the structure of the world, yet we cannot but take them seriously. So again, we're in this strange predicament where science tells us there is no such thing as beauty, there is no such thing as meaning, there is no such thing as value, but at the same time, we cannot live in any other way but to take this seriously, or ultimately say, okay, then it's meaningless and what, commit suicide. So basically, it's a world that ends up in a series of dualisms, where we end up in this split between mind or self, which is severed from its corporeal domain, from the world, from the others. Again, all of this stems from this particular incision or break that I've just mentioned with the development of modern science and this bifurcation and correlative disenchantment of the world. Now, all of this is in and of itself a problem, but it becomes even more of a problem once we enter into the domain of mind. Why? Because mind seems to be the seat, the domain, the topos of precisely that which is said to be illusory, namely the domain of experience, the domain of subjectivity, the domain of mentality. All of these things that in this bifurcated world were put to the side is, in a certain sense, the domain of mind. So what do you do with this? What does science do with this? What does science do when it approaches the mind? And this is the central question that the authors try to tackle in this particular book. And they approach it against the horizon that I've just tried to delineate, that I've just tried to present. So for them, this is a question that has a profound epistemic weight, but it also has a profound existential weight. So they see it as a question that really needs to be answered, and it needs to be answered not because of merely scientific rigor, but also because of existential vigor. So both of these domains need to be addressed properly. And the authors try to do this by putting forward what they call a new, what can be called a new intertwining. I will explain what kind of intertwining, but I would just like to say that they're trying to find a way how to bring these two domains together again, precisely in the domain of the mind. They try to show that these two domains that have been severed, that these two domains that have been separated, they actually can be brought together again, and that a productive dialogue, a productive dialectic between them can be established. Okay, so what they're putting forward is definitely not anti-science, as you've seen so far by reading the book, but still it poses a big threat. Why? Because it actually requires, as Marek pointed out, a radical, thoroughgoing restructuring of science and how it is embedded into the larger social cultural framework, into the larger human existential domain. Yeah. So fundamentally, it requires opening of many of these here be dragons areas, hic sunt dracones domains. And this, as I've mentioned at the beginning, possibly means that the map that we currently have will crumble and that we will need a new map. And this new map will have to cover and address both of the two issues that I mentioned, the epistemological one and the experiential one. Now, this intertwining, the way they go about doing it, by the way, this is now the recap. Yeah, we're doing the recap. We've entered into the book and we're kind of rehashing the main points. The way they want to achieve this particular goal, this circularity between science and experience, is by focusing both on the development within the sciences of the mind, which nowadays go by the name of cognitive sciences, but they also want to bring some other players into the discussion. Yeah, phenomenology on the one hand. Why? Because phenomenology is a philosophical tradition which insists on the importance of taking experience serious. So they, from the very get-go, say, we're not just going to pretend that experience is something that is illusory, secondary, what have you. We're going to have it as a valid interlocutor in this particular discussion. And then the third player are contemplative traditions, more specifically Buddhist tradition. Why? Because from their perspective, they not only speak about lived experience, but they have manners and modes and ways of actually tackling it, dealing with it, modifying it. The central theme, the central topic around, which basically they use as a sort of a testing ground for what they're doing, is the self. Why self? Well, because on the one hand, the self is in a certain sense a hinge around which all three of these traditions in one way or another circulate. So they're all interested in the question of the mind and therefore of the self. And basically the phenomenon of life is closely related to the self. Normally, when we think about mind, we think about our mind, which means ourself. Yeah. So when we think about mind, we usually think in terms of selfhood. And the way we conceive of selfhood would also determine how we will understand the mind. Okay. On the other hand, the reason why they choose the self is because in contemporary cognitive science, self has a strange problematic status. Namely, because cognitive science focuses on the neurophysiological processes, it has led to the fragmentation of the self. It would seem that the self as a unitary whole is no longer present. So it has been profoundly problematized. On the other hand, also many of the approaches simply seem to be extremely disembodied. So the self is something that is relegated to the brain, to the head, and also to certain very abstract processes within that particular region of the body. So what they're trying to do is they're trying to ground the question of the mind by tackling the question of the self. And as is clear from the very title of the book, they're trying to do it by revitalizing the notion of the body. In the body, they see a certain phenomenon which has two aspects, both the objective aspect, so I can study the bodies as a scientist from the outside, and I can also live the body. I always live in and through my embodiment, in and through the corporality. It is the tissue that binds me to the world. Yeah, when we were talking about the forest previously, it is through my corporeality that I am anchored in this panoply of sounds and scents and so on and so forth. Okay, now this is going to be a little bit of a textbook part, because I would really like us to go through very quickly through the several developmental phases of cognitive science and what the problem with these approaches are from the perspective of the authors of the book, because it will be extremely important both for our chapter and for what follows. Okay, so in the book, the authors mention 4 particular stages. Well, one is a pre-stage, which is cybernetics, and we're not going to talk about this, but the 2 main stages are cognitivism and emergence. And they critique these particular approaches and also how they conceive of the mind / the self. And this will be important both for this chapter 7 and from what follows. So starting with cognitivism, you are probably all familiar, quite familiar with this particular approach, so I'm not going to spend too much time on it. The main idea here is, the main leading grounding metaphor is that the mind is akin to the digital computer. After a while, this akin or similar to was simply forgotten, and it was simply assumed that the mind is the digital computer, okay? But the idea is that the mind and cognition have to do something with information processing or symbol manipulating. So the mind is a symbol manipulating machine. And there is a all-encompassing maxim here, which says that the brain, just like the computer, processes information from the outside world. Now, if cognition is information processing, what exactly does this mean? Like I said, information processing is another word for symbol manipulation. What is meant by symbol? Symbol is simply an item which has a physical form. It is instantiated in something physical, in the brain, and it stands for something. So it stands for something that is not itself. It stands for some other entity outside in the world, okay? And calculation or manipulation, what is meant by this particular term is that there are certain algorithmic rules, there are certain syntactic rules which tell us how to process these symbols, okay? So basically the mind is like a huge symbol calculating machine, yeah? A machine which represents things from the outside. And you have this nicely depicted on this image, which I took from the Tree of Knowledge in the bottom right corner of the slide, where you have Caesar watching a bird outside, and basically the whole representationalist process is taking place in these consecutive steps within the Caesar's mind. So what we hear here is that basically the mind and cognition is something that is so the cognition, the mind processes are something that is linear. So it is something that is happening successively, linearly. As we see on the picture here, we have usually this input-output scheme where you have an input and then you have a whole different things happening consequentially within the cognitive system, and then we get the appropriate output. It is discrete. This means that the mind is constituted of discrete, separate modules which are responsible for individual mental functions, and it is also related to representation. So the cognition basically represents the external world, how things are in the external world. One thing that we can get from this is that the mind or the self is basically structured like a machine. It is like machine. It is a machine-like composite. It is atomistic, static, abstract, and basically separate from the world. Yeah, so the idea is that cognition and mind are something very abstract. They are very much in line with a very mechanical, causal, efficient conception of the world. So this particular view was challenged by the other paradigm that the authors present, and this is what they call emergence. Basically, this is something that is most often known as connectionism. And here, the metaphor of the digital computer is replaced by the metaphor of the brain. So the idea is, if we want to understand the mind, we basically have to go to phenomena and entities that are clearly instantiating some sort of cognition and mindedness. So, you know, let's go to living beings and their brains, which seem to be the best places which we could look to. And instead of digital computer, like I said, here we have neural networks. Now, cognition on this second paradigm is no longer symbolic computation, no longer manipulation of symbols, no longer information processing in that particular narrow sense of the term. Instead, cognition has to do with stable emergent patterns. And this is something that is very important also for the chapter that we'll be covering and for what follows later on. What this means basically is that you have certain local processes which are distributed. Yeah, so they operate like individually and locally, they interact. And after a while, these processes establish a certain global pattern which becomes stable. So it's a dynamic pattern, but which becomes stable. It acquires a certain form. Yeah, and this is something that is related to the artificial networks. I provided a little picture here of the artificial network. It's not really important how it works. What is important is that basically you have a network which consists of these neuron-like units or nodes, these little dots, and they are all interconnected, as you see. And these connections change given certain rules and given the activity of this particular network. And the thing is that after a while, this network will start showing certain stable patterns. And this is what is deemed to be cognition here. It is no longer this slow symbolic process, but something that pertains to the network as a whole. So instead of having a linear sequence of steps here, what we have is parallel processing. Yeah, so something that happens in the network as a whole, not something that follows a strict sequence, and it is distributed. So it is basically spread out the whole network. So one analogy that is used in the embodied mind is that instead of having a chain of command in cognition, so instead of having like, you know, a hierarchy of commands that goes from top to bottom, what you have is something that is more similar to a cocktail party conversation. So you have people who are talking with one another. There's a lot of noise. There's a lot of things going on at the same time, and you hear certain fragments, but eventually the whole group kind of establishes a certain stable dynamics. And despite all the din, despite people talking past each other, you're somehow able to kind of understand what's going on. Yeah. So this is how these neural networks work. It's way more messy, but still it kind of functions. Okay, so here the mind and self becomes a patterned whole. We see it's different. It's no longer atomistic. It's more systemic, more holistic. It's dynamic. It's more concrete, which means that it is related to these particular neural networks that embody it, but it's still separate. It's still construed as something that is severed from the world. So still these neural networks have to be fed information, and they are then assessed given the output that they provide. So there is an external observer that has to kind of correlate what they're doing. They are not functioning, operating on themselves. They are always already introduced into a certain world and into a certain domain of information. So what is retained is the notion or the phenomenon of representation. And the authors say that this phenomenon, representation, there has been a growing dissatisfaction with this particular phenomenon. and that both on the experiential and scientific level, it has proven to be problematic. And this is basically our entryway into the chapter 7. So they provide critiques of cognitivism, connectionism, show what kind of a conception of self and mind they entail. And they say that even though connectionism managed to provide a more systemic, more holistic, more dynamic conception of the self, still it retained the notion of representation. What do we mean by representation, to repeat, and we will get into this now? It is this idea that the cognitive system represents something that is outside of itself. So it stands for, it contains a certain something that stands for something that is outside of itself. Okay, so now we're slowly entering the den of the serpent. Yeah, we're going to try to uncover some of these hic sunt dracones, some of these representations of dragons, which might eventually lead to the restructuring of the framework. So the chapter starts in the following manner. Why should it be threatening to question the idea that the world has pre-given properties that we represent? Why do we become nervous when we call into question the idea that there is some way that the world is out there independent of our cognition, and that cognition is a representation of that independent world? So the author says that very often, if you start questioning the concept of representation, many scientists will simply say, you know what, I'm not particularly interested in this question. This is basically a philosophical question, because how else are you going to understand cognition? And what did we say at the very beginning when we were talking about hic sunt dracones? Very often it is precisely those aspects in our map of the world which go without saying, which are self-evident, which are clear, which basically start with how else. This is where the dragons are hidden. This is where those domains are hidden, which might eventually unhinge the map that we are currently using. Or as Ludwig Wittgenstein says very, very clearly and lucidly, the aspects of things that are most important for us are hidden because of their simplicity and familiarity. One is unable to notice something because it is always before one's eyes. So it is that which is constantly there, which is constantly in front of our eyes, that we become most blind to. And this is usually where the pathway to the dragon's den can be hidden. Okay, so what exactly do authors mean by representation? They basically provide two different conceptions of representation. One is a weak one, pragmatic one, and the other is strong one, ontological one. They're more interested in the strong one, ontological one. So this is the one they have issues with. Okay, what is the pragmatic conception? This basically means representation as construal or interpretation. What do I mean by that? This basically means that you're always able to see a certain something as something else. Put differently, you're always able to establish certain correlations between two different structures. They, for instance, provide the example of a map and geographical area. So you have a map, yeah, and you can use this particular set of patterns and structures to represent a certain something. So you're able to use certain patterns to represent or speak of something else. Yeah? They also, for example, provide another example of written squibbles in a book, which basically stand for spoken words, and these stand for things in the world. So you have a word lamp in the book, and then it stands for something that is vocal in character, and this stands for a given entity in the world. So this is just the capacity to establish certain correlations, and this is not problematic. Because why is it not problematic? Because it doesn't really carry any ontological and epistemological consequences. It doesn't say anything about how we think about the world and what the world is like. Now, the second conception, which is more problematic, is the ontological one. Here, they say that representation is a basis for action. And here is how they spell it out. They say that this conception of representation is founded on the following presuppositions: that you have a world out there which exists in and of itself, on its own, and its features are pre-given. So if you were to eliminate all the living beings from the world would be the same. The features are pre-given. our cognition refers to this world. Okay, so our cognitive apparatus somehow refers to this world, and cognition itself is basically representing, mirroring this particular world. Mirroring in a very loose sense of the term, it can be problematic, but never mind. And once you have these representations, once you have representations of the world in the mind, you can use them to then structure your behavior to act properly in the world. And this they refer to in this particular chapter as a cognitive realism. Yeah. So cognitive realism, in the sense, realism means simply that the world exists in and of its own, and cognition basically has access to it through representation. This they have issues with. So the first understanding of representation simply tells us something about the capacity that we humans have about establishing certain relations between two different sets of patterns or structures. Now, the more important question is whether this capacity is the foundational capacity of how we engage or relate with the world from the very beginning. And they mention a criticism of this. They might say, yeah, well, you know, the way you present representation in this particular way is not really fair, because you present it as something passive, but actually representation in cognitive science is something way more active. For example, it can stand for active hypothesis formation. So the cognitive apparatus forms certain hypotheses about the world, and then it sees whether they are feasible or unfeasible, whether the actions are successful or not. And the authors say, okay, this is a fair point. You know, the technicalities here we can discuss, but the main central issue remains the same. So the ontological and epistemological framework and background is the same. So the idea is ontologically that the world is pre-existing, pre-specified, it is out there, exists in and of itself. And from the epistemological perspective, cognition, that is to say, knowing about the world, is basically recovering or reconstructing, mirroring in the loose sense of these external features. But regardless of technicalities, the authors say, there is a more general response to these types of objections. And here the authors very briefly mention something that is developed and explained in depth in the previous books by Francisco Varela. The first one, Principles of Biological Autonomy from 1979, and the Tree of Knowledge that was quoted by Umberto Maturana from 1987, I think. You can maybe correct me on the dates, but the idea is this, that within the science itself, the neuroscience itself, there has been an erosion, an implosion of this idea of representationalism. So there has been an emergence of anti-representationalist trends within the science itself. And they designate this as the move from heteronymous systems towards autonomous systems. Now, this is why I wanted us to go through cognitivism and connectionism. Both cognitivist and connectionist systems are heteronymous systems, okay? What does that mean? They are basically input-output systems. In other words, they are governed from the outside. This is what heteronymous means. You have an external outside law that is governing you. So you have information that comes from outside, from the external world, and then basically you have to kind of process it in one way or another, and you will respond in a certain sense. However, according to the authors of the Embodied Mind, once you have this idea of cognition and mind as being this neural network, this systemic whole, you cannot simply presuppose that this is true. So once you have this more dynamic, systemic conception of the mind, the relationship towards the world also changes, and the world itself changes. So an important thing here, you change the notion understanding of the mind, you change the notion understanding of the world, okay? And basically what they do is they refer to this idea that was developed in biology and also neuroscience of self-organizing, self-producing systems. Now, we cannot go into this in great detail, and hopefully this is something that you will be covering later on in later chapters when the focus will be on Enaction itself. But autonomous systems, according to the authors, are characterized not by representation or input-output, but by operational closure. This means that basically these systems constantly try to keep a certain equilibrium, a certain dynamic equilibrium, which allows them to function and manifest as specific systems. So all the processes within this system are basically circular in nature, in the sense of that they constantly try to keep or maintain the form, the structure of this particular system. Yeah. So any external stimulus, any external perturbation will not be already structured as a information, but it will be something that will be more like a challenge to this particular system, to this particular whole, because this whole will have to restructure itself in such a way to accommodate this particular perturbation in a way that will allow it to maintain itself as a whole. These are this is what it's meant by autonomous systems. So you have systems which basically have to keep them, they have to maintain their own conditions of possibility fairly constant. Yeah. So this means that they will also determine what will be significant for them. So the stimuli that come from outside, they will determine which stimuli and in what structure they will be relevant for them. So the most important thing from all of this is that the authors try to say that from the scientific perspective, what you get is you already have within the science itself a development of a very different view of what mind and cognition is. So you don't have this representationalist view anymore, but it's a view that is way more dynamic, that is more, that emphasizes this ongoing interrelatedness between the autonomous system and the world, which affects it, and then which becomes structured by this particular autonomous unit in a way that is in line with this unit's need to maintain its autonomy. Now, this is explained very briefly in the book, and it's something that could basically, you know, have a lecture that would require a lecture of its own. So we can hopefully get into this into greater detail later in the discussion. But this is the main idea. Okay, now we move on to the Cartesian anxiety. So the first step in this particular chapter is to show that the question of the problem of representation is problematic already from the epistemic, that is to say, from the scientific perspective. So science itself is internally undermining the problem of representation. However, as I said from the beginning, if we want to tackle the bifurcation, the split that has happened with the development of modern science in our conception of reality, if we want to heal the schizophrenia that I mentioned, we have to tackle it on both the epistemic level and existential level. So the authors now inquire, what is it that makes representation so unquestionable for us? Why a representation, or why is the representationalist view or stance so self-evident to us? So they want to go to the existential level. And they say that the reason for this is that because there is a very profound, very strong urge towards finding a ground or a certainty in our philosophical and scientific tradition. Now, why Cartesian anxiety? By the way, Cartesian anxiety is a term that was introduced by Richard Bernstein, and the authors adopt. But what are they referring for? I think that the best way to introduce it is by simply taking a look at this nice quote that is taken from the second meditation, Descartes' second meditation. And it really, really nicely delineates, points out what the issue is. So Descartes talks about his process of doubting. He decided that he's going to doubt everything until he finds something that is truly solid, truly certain. And this is the way he recaps his process of doubting. So serious are the doubts into which I have been thrown as a result of yesterday's meditation that I can neither put them out of my mind nor see any way of resolving them. It feels as if I have fallen unexpectedly into a deep whirlpool. So he was thrown into a deep whirlpool, which tumbles me around so that I can neither stand on the bottom nor swim up to the top. This is a perfect depiction. He can neither stand on the bottom nor can he reach the top. So he's caught in the in-between region, and it's just dreadful. This is dreadful for him. It's unbearable. Okay. Nevertheless, I will make an effort once more attempt to the same path which I started on yesterday. Anything which admits of the slightest doubt, I will set aside just as if I had found it to be wholly false. And I will proceed in this way until I recognize something certain, or if nothing else, until I at least recognize for certain that there is no certainty. Archimedes, Descartes says, used to demand just one firm and immovable point in order to shift the entire earth. So I need just one firm and immovable point, and I will shift the entire epistemic structure. So I too hope for the great things if I manage to find just one thing, however slight, that is certain and unshakable. So basically, underpinning this this acceptance of representation is a certain profound dilemma, a certain very deep-rooted dilemma. Namely, either we have a fixed and stable foundation for knowledge, or we cannot escape some sort of darkness, chaos, and confusion. In other words, either there is an absolute ground or foundation, or everything falls apart. So basically, the authors say that Cartesian anxiety can be best depicted by the following dilemma. You have one extreme, which is the extreme of absolutism. Absolutism basically is a craving for absolute ground, and it can take two different forms. It can be either realism, which means that you try to find ground in the external world. So there is an external reality that is unchanging, firm, unshakable, like with cognitive realism that we've mentioned in the previous section. So there's a world out there and it is independent of me. This is my firm ground. However, since this has become problematic, some authors, some thinkers have proclaimed that the opposite extreme is true. This is the extreme of idealism or constructivism. So there is no external reality. The only reality that exists is the subjective reality, reality of the mind, the domain of the mental. This is the only ground that is there. So this is the extreme of absolutism, which has two faces. And if we basically say, well, this is wrong, you can have this type of absolutism, basically what you end up with is nihilism. This means that either you have a firm ground or you have chaos, anarchy, and relativism. And as you know, the past 2 centuries have basically in many ways been an ongoing oscillation between these two extremes. So now we're moving to the last part of this particular chapter, which is steps towards the middle way. Now we see that representation has a certain preconception of how subject and the object are related. They both presuppose that the subject and the object are somehow split and that you have to choose between them. Yeah. However, what the authors point out is that this conception of the subject-object relation might seem as normal, organic, self-evident. However, it is not so. It is actually very pliable. It is modifiable. And it actually developed in a very specific context. It developed, like I said at the very beginning, with the emergence of science, more precisely in within the time frame of the so-called scientific revolution, which take place from 16th to 18th century. And this is, according to the authors, the time frame where the mind as the mirror of nature was developed. So this idea of mind as being a mirror of nature, as that which represents or mirrors what is outside of itself. Yeah. So what we said at the very beginning, we were talking about the bifurcation and disenchantment. This is related to this. According to authors, in other words, this relationship between subject and object, it's itself historical and is basically laden with philosophical presuppositions. So it's not a given. Yeah. Another Hic sunt dracones moment. You know, it's just self-evident. Well, this is again where probably the dragon will be hidden. So once you have this established, once the subject-object distinction is established, it just becomes a blind spot. Like we said, it becomes a Hic sunt dracones. You don't mess with this because, you know, we have to accept this, otherwise the whole map will just fall apart. But the main problem is that behind this subject-object distinction, either or distinction, lies a presupposition that there is no third way, there is no third possibility. So as they say in philosophy, tertium non datur. So there is no third factor, no third possibility. The authors, however, say this is not the case. And they basically draw on a very specific tradition, and this is a very interesting aspect of this particular book. They draw on Madhyamaka, which is literally a translation of this particular term is middle way, and it is a tradition within Buddhism, part of the Mahayana tradition, whose one of the grounding fathers is Nagarjuna, the famous philosopher Nagarjuna, and this Madhyamaka tradition is an integral, central part of Tibetan Buddhism. Now, why do they go to Madhyamaka? By the way, just incidentally, in parenthesis, throughout the book, they also, of course, also refer to phenomenology as another tradition, which allows us for this in between. But it's something that we cannot get into otherwise, you know, this already overtly long presentation will be even longer. So Madhyamaka, why is Madhyamaka so interesting for authors? Because Madhyamaka says that this clash between absolutism on the one hand and nihilism on the other, the two extremes that I've mentioned, are actually, despite superficial, despite seeming to stand for two opposites, are actually two sides of the same coin. So they are two faces of the same phenomenon, and this phenomenon is what they refer to as foundationalism. I know a lot of isms in these presentations, but you know, they're fairly straightforward. Basically, the idea is that there is a certain grasping, a certain clinging for a solid ground, and this can manifest in two ways, which seem to be opposite, but are actually the manifestation of the same way. And because you only see these two extremes, you're unable to see the in-between possibility. Okay? So basically, absolutism says there has to be a certain being. Yeah? There has to be a certain something which is certain. Okay? So there is a certain thing-like conception of reality. There are things, there are entities that that have their own essences, their own beings, and I can find one which is certain. It can be the external world, it can be internal world, it can be something in the external world, it can be something in the internal world. Now, failing to find something like this, what is the alternative? Well, this is the other extreme of nihilism. So instead of being, there is no being. So if there is no such thing, well, then there is nothing. But already in the word itself, we see that the same conception of reality is there. So, you know, thinkhood-like conception of reality is also present here. So you will say, okay, if there is no such thing that would be certain, then there is at least this utmost absolute void, like a negative thing, which has to be certain. So even though I'm saying, okay, I've given up on certainty, I actually still want certainty because I'm clinging onto the negation of the certainty in the form of thinghood. So instead of a thing, I'm now grasping for a no thing. But there's the same impulse behind it all. So Madhyamaka provides an alternative. It provides an alternative that the authors refer to as groundlessness. So instead of focusing on finding a ground, what we try to is to enter into the domain of groundlessness. And what does this mean? Well, instead of focusing on finding discrete, stable, certain things, we should focus on phenomena. Phenomena always appear against other phenomena, which means that by their nature, they are interdependent. Although you can focus on one specific phenomenon, you always focus on it against a whole plethora of different phenomena. So for instance, if I see a certain thing in my visual field, a lamp, for instance, other aspects of the visual field have to become the horizon, the background of this particular thing. Now, I might pretend that they don't exist, but the truth is that they are the ones that allow this phenomena to give itself to me. So there's an intrinsic interdependence between phenomena, between things, if I don't think about them in this entity-like, essence-like way, okay? So this in the Buddhist tradition is encapsulated or captured by this idea of codependent arising and correlated conception or idea of compassion. So phenomena arise codependently. Whenever a certain phenomenon is given to me, other phenomena have to restructure itself accordingly. And when I shift my attention, the phenomena shift as well, okay? And I myself am always included in this equation as well. And once I have this conception, when I no longer see reality as structured from these separate things, but interrelated phenomena, I also change my way of approaching them. I no longer see myself as separate from them, severed from them, but somehow closely intertwined with all of them. So that's one thing why Madhyamaka is so important, because it has a positive account of groundlessness, which is neither absolutist nor nihilist. But another thing why it is so important is because it's not only a theoretical system, but also pertains to the domain of experience or existence. So Madhyamaka says, the tradition of Madhyamaka claims that this groundlessness, this interdependence is not only something that you should conceptualize. It's not only a certain way of thinking about the world, but it's also a certain way of life, a certain mode of existence. It's something that you have to cultivate, that you have to live, that you have to put into your daily practice. So the codependence that I mentioned previously is something that pertains to both levels that we mentioned at the very beginning, both to the epistemic level, so we have to be able to think it, but we also have to be able to live it. So it's also something that is relevant for the existential level. So here we have another dragon that we've unleashed. So once we've unscrewed the image of the representation, what came out is this brute reality, immediate reality that is underneath it. And this is this ongoing idea that instead of having the subject-object dichotomy, the subject-object split, the severance of myself from the world and the others and from my body, there is instead a certain interrelation, interpenetration between myself and the world, between what we call mentality and corporeality, between myself and the other, okay? And the notion of inaction, now this is very important, the notion of inaction, which will play a crucial role in the upcoming chapters, is precisely the notion that was developed specifically by Varela to capture this interrelatedness, this idea of co-constitution, co-implication, co-determination. He uses a lot of different terms to describe this between myself and the world. So this co-emergence, yeah, of what we call the self and its world. Okay, so this is basically the chapter. And now just 2 brief slides about what follows. I said that codependence has to be both thought and lived. What will follow from this phase onwards is, first, they are going to try to develop an alternative, a scientific alternative to cognitivism and emergence. That is why, again, I wanted us to go through these 2 approaches again. So they are going to try to develop an alternative account of mind and cognition along the lines of what we've said here. And instead of using the metaphor of either computers or neural networks, they're going to use as the main leading metaphor living systems. And living systems, like I said, are autonomous systems, and autonomous systems are characterized by this interpenetration between the system itself and its surrounding. Okay, so the notion of inaction will be an attempt to basically take what is valuable in connectionism, this dynamic, holistic, systemic conception of the self, and then just think it through, where you basically don't have an external world that needs to be represented, but an external world which is constantly interrelated to the autonomous system itself. So this is the first chunk that they will be doing. They will be trying to develop the idea of codependence through the concept of inaction. Then, however, I said that the concept of inaction also has to be lived. So the question is, once you have this idea of inaction, which means basically that the world and myself are constantly co-emerging, co-arising, co-implying, co-determining, what does this mean for my world, for my reality, for myself? Yeah. So how do I enact an action? So how do I take on board what I've taken, what I've learned from this book? Because again, the question is not just to tackle the problem on the epistemic level, but also on the existential level. It's not a sophisticated Sudoku, it's an existential Sudoku, and it has to be integrated into one's everyday lived practice. So here again, they go to Madhyamaka, to this particular Buddhist tradition that we've mentioned, which basically developed a whole plethora of modes and means of how to bring this idea of codependence into one's life. So basically, how to cultivate a way of life, a mode of existence that is anchored in this idea of codependence, which takes the inaction without necessarily using this term seriously. And then they basically spell out the ethical implications of this through the notion of planetary thinking, which I think is extremely relevant for contemporary times. And they do this through the notion of compassion. So hopefully, in a certain sense, I hope that now you see in what way Hic sunt dracones was relevant for our particular story. So the notion of representation is one such image of the dragon. And what the authors try to do, both in this particular chapter and in the book as a whole, is to unscrew this particular image, this representation, and see what lies beneath it. And lo and behold, there's a dragon. There's a Ouroboros, this old dragon that's chasing its own tail, which basically is a symbol that depicts this idea of codependence, co-constitution, co-emergence, which we saw was crucial for the notion of enaction and for the embodied mind as a whole. So this is it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sebastian. There is a wealth of riches. We have raided the dragon's hoard and made ourselves off very well as a result. So the chapter 7 being, as it were, a kind of a moment to reflect on and live in the discomfort. A discomfort break in the middle of the book, as it were. We might briefly have a comfort break as we reflect on the material we've just imbibed and what can come next. As I read it, it is 15 minutes past the hour. So if we take just 5 minutes and reconvene at 20 minutes past the hour, and then we can get stuck into some questions and discussion. So I'll see you in just 5 minutes. Thanks. Hi, folks. Welcome back. So we have a nice, good length of time for some discussion and questions, and some hands already starting to go up. So we'll try and take questions. We'll just give people another moment or two just to reconvene, and then we'll get started, and we'll try and take questions in the order they come up. Certainly plenty to discuss. It would help if I put my microphone back on. That would, Okay, so yeah, I think we can probably get started. My apologies now if I start mangling or mispronouncing names, but Hamden, your name, your hand went up first, I believe.
Yes, so first of all, good to see you, Sebastian. Great presentation. I especially enjoyed this golden thread of the golden dragon that kind of followed through this whole thing. A lot of beautiful metaphors in there. And I think the most important one is the one you talked about last, which is this of the self-reference, or also the interdependence between world and self, because this is kind of enactivism's and also Buddhism's answer, or at least Nagarjuna's answer to the problem, to the middle way, the actual answer to the problem of the two foundations that are like too extreme. And then I always have the same problem, and your presentation really beautifully reminded me again of this problem in activism. Well, it's not even really a problem, it's more of a I would call it like a blind spot, because they use this idea of the autonomous system of this operational closure as the answer to the conception of the mind, right? Like the mind is supposed to be this self-referential, dialectically conceived system, and therefore we kind of solve this dualistic idea of conceiving it as something fixed and something essentialistic. But then for me, the obvious kind of question is, why don't we just apply the same metaphor to the world? Because we conceive the world in a very similar way as this essentialistic thing. And once we only apply this solution to the mind, I feel we already fall back into the dualism without being aware of it, because now the world is again somehow conceived as more stable, because the mind is now self-referentially changing and so on. But what about the world? So this was my question.
Yeah, thanks. Good to see you as well, Hamdin. Yeah, that's a good question, and this is a question that, in many ways, I would say that the enactivist approach, to be completely honest, has left unanswered. So there is no single straightforward answer to this particular question. There have been attempts, of course, to apply the notions of autonomy and autopoiesis to larger structures, most famously to societies, for instance, and then also to, say, the whole ecosystem, the famous Gaia hypothesis, and so on and so forth. Now, I can say from studying Francisco's works, I can say that he never came to a point where he would have a fully blown answer to this question, or this problem. So even in his later interviews, the interviews from 90s, so late 1990s, he pointed out this question of, for example, he talks about meshwork of selfless selves. So you have these different selves that are somehow, as he sometimes puts it, imbricated in one another. They are interrelated, they interpenetrate, and so on and so forth. But there is no clear answer as to how to conceive of this. So how to understand this particular question, how to understand this particular problem and how to answer it. It's definitely, it's an intriguing question, and I think that it can be tackled in different ways. So one way that people have tried now to answer it is by combining enaction with certain authors that are more, let's say, that try to provide more large-scale cosmological conceptions of reality. So Hegel would be one answer, the one that you would be most interested in. But there have also been attempts to kind of fuse Varela with Whitehead. So both of these authors, I don't want to just name drop, have developed like these grander, larger schemes or attempts to answer a question as to, how about basically the dynamics and the structure of reality. So going very, very deep to the very fundamental philosophical questions. And some people think that this is one way to go about doing this. Another way of doing this is by trying to underscore certain differences between different systems and saying in what way, for example, living systems might differ from ecosystems as such, so that you do emphasize the important and significant distinctions. And yeah, I mean, there's no easy answer to this one for sure. For instance, one of the things that Varela was quite clear about, one of the things that he didn't like was, for instance, these transpositions of the idea of autonomy and autopoiesis on the social level. So he said that there are some legitimate uses of this that are in a certain sense more like metaphorical, or they use the conception in parallel, but just using them uncritically, that for him was a no-go. He had huge issues with that. And Maturana was also not a big fan. So, as to whether he would be okay with trying to do something similar for the ecosystem, I don't know. I guess that he would have issues, but I'm not sure to what degree he would have a full-blown comprehensive answer to this.
Thank you. Great answer.
I'm not sure it was just like, there is no answer. It was a groundless answer.
That's a nice chewy one to start us off. So, but thank you very much for that to both of you for that. Maxime, I think you're up next.
Yeah. Thank you, Sebastian, for your presentation. It was really interesting and exciting and inspiring. And I have a question about rather a kind of historical intervention into this field, because I was interested in Varela's earlier contribution in cybernetics, because in your presentation, you were talking as if the cybernetic stage of development of studies of minds is significant, but is kind of subject to Aufhebung in Hegelian terms. So I was thinking that probably the cybernetic legacy of enactivism is still important, because I think that Varela's reflection about codependent arising and mutual constitution is not of, strictly speaking, not of phenomenological nature, and is not the part of the Husserlian legacy, but is rather a part of Varela's earlier work in so-called neo-cybernetic dialectics, which you are talking about in one of your papers. And I was thinking that probably we should take into account this cybernetic legacy, because it's not only simply one of the historical facts, such as, for example, neural networks was the part of first generation of cybernetics in McCulloch and Pitts, but also the fact that enactivism is the part of neo-cybernetic movements. And I mean in particular the second order cybernetics, in which the interest was concentrated on recursive, self-referential processes, and so on and so forth. So my question was about what do you think about the cybernetic legacy in this work, and can we say that it was overcame by these scholars? Thank you.
Okay, so thank you very much for this question. This is a great question. So how do I go about answering? Several things that I would like to point out here. So first thing I would like to point out is that Varela, throughout his work, was definitely heavily influenced by the cybernetic tradition, as you said, the second order cybernetic movement. Okay, so for example, he later on moved from certain models that were present in the cybernetics movement to the dynamic systems models. But these, as you kind of pointed, they had a common history, so they were all rooted in that particular trajectory. One thing I would like to maybe underscore here, and I think this is a very important one and an oft overlooked one. Namely, Francisco, in many ways, he's a meeting point of two very interesting developments in the 20th century Western thought, if you like, that started off from two seemingly opposite starting points. One is phenomenology, the second one is cybernetics. And now here's an interesting thing. Let's start with cybernetics. Cybernetics wanted to become a science of sciences, almost like a science of systems. So, in a certain sense, to develop a science that would be able to account for the behavior of all systems, to provide formal grounds, formal frameworks for doing that. And then you can basically apply it to a whole myriad of different sciences, which seem to be different, but actually through this lens would become very similar. Now, the interesting thing that happened in cybernetics is that they started off as science, which means as, here we are, we're going to observe the systems and we're going to describe them and account for them. And after a while, in this particular context, a question emerged for cyberneticians. Well, I, as an observer, am a system. If I want to build a comprehensive science, I have to include myself as a system into the equation. So an approach which started off as a rigorous science that wanted to have nothing of the, observer or what have you in the whole story, ended up having to introduce the observer into the whole equation. So cybernetics realized that if you start from the objective side, I'm just going to observe systems, you end up in the subjective side, so you have to take into account the subject. Now, phenomenology started in a different way, but ended up in the opposite extreme in a certain sense. So it started off with Husserl from this idea of pure consciousness. I'm just going to start from consciousness, from experience, and I'm going to bracket the external world. And then what happened? You had Heidegger, you had Merleau-Ponty, and they both emphasized, this doesn't work. Sooner or later, you have to include the world into the story. So if you start on the one extreme, or the other extreme of the world, of the conception of the pure consciousness, pure experience, you end up having to introduce the world. So cybernetics started from the world, had to introduce the subject, whereas phenomenology started from the transcendental subject, had to reintroduce the world. And Francisco saw this is something that is really, really important. Like there's an interesting conflation there. Like from within these two traditions came to a certain point where they had to self-transcend their original presupposition. And he really, really appreciated cybernetics for its recognition that if you really want to have science that would go all in, be science with a capital S, it will sooner or later have to reintroduce the subject. Now, the problem that he had with some of the developments within cybernetics is that they overshot the mark. So they started off by no observer, no subjective component, and then some of them ended by espousing radical constructivism. So this idea that basically the world is a construction. And this was too much for him. He didn't want to go that far. He thought that this was a mistake, and this is also why eventually he withdrew from that particular movement. He had a huge admiration for von Fürsten. So he was one of the most important figures in the second order cybernetics. And for him, he was one of the intellectual fathers. He explicitly says in one of the papers that Maturana was his father, but von Förster and Bateson were his intellectual grandfathers. So, he had huge respect for them. However, he thought that some of the developments went into the wrong direction. So that's why he tried to also draw on other different traditions to kind of try to keep to this middle ground. He didn't want to overshoot the mark. Yeah, so he didn't want to go from being a science which doesn't take care of subjectivity to science which ends up with a subject being the one that constructs reality. That was too much for him. In early Varela, you find this position. So he was kind of oscillating constantly. He was kind of saying some stuff like that because he was so heavily involved in the cybernetic tradition, but he was also trying to always qualify, yeah, you know, I don't want to go that far. But then eventually he wanted to move away from that. That's also why he kind of let this particular strand go, because many of the second order cyberneticians went in the direction of radical constructivism. And this, according to him, was a step too far. So in some of the later interviews, he explicitly says that people, especially in Germany, associate him with this tradition. And regardless of how much he says that he doesn't want to have, you know, anything to do with radical constructivism in this particular radical sense of the term, it's to no avail. But he really doesn't. He really tries to find a middle ground. And I think that he was inspired by what the second order cybernetics did, but then failed to follow through. So that would be one answer to this particular question.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you both for that. Thanks for the question and the rich response there. Ralph, you're up next. You need to unmute there, Ralph.
Thank you, Sebastian. Your talk was very interesting. I have three observations more than questions. And I don't want to get into any kind of exegesis of Varela's work or anything like that. But the three, and I'm going to avoid the metaphysical question of reality, but I am very sympathetic to a relational view of reality, which I think is what they're trying to get at. Yeah. My three observations are I wonder whether this problem has its origin in the 16th to the 18th century, or a little bit further back. For example, if you go to Plato, or even the pre-Socratics, and the idea of the one that underlies and supports everything. You're getting there that split that you mentioned at the beginning of your talk between the appearance and the reality, etc., but not in scientific terms, in other terms. So I just wonder whether this goes, you can trace it back to modernism, or you've got to go further back in the history of thought to trace this idea. The second observation is whether yesterday I was actually listening to an interview with Daniel Dennett, and I'm not going to for a second going to suggest that Daniel Dennett is close to Varela, Rosch, and Thompson, but he was talking about determinism, and he said the problem with determinism is that we've looked at physics and we should have been looking at biology, because if you look at biology, if you look at physics, everything is determined. If you look at biology, you see that the natural evolution of the species has created a species that's very good at avoiding things for its own survival, yeah, in our case, and in the case of other species as well. And to a certain extent, that overcomes determinism, because you're always reacting to things in order to avoid them, in order to survive. And you're at the same time creating an environment which helps you survive, and which obviously also interferes with other conditioners or determinants of one kind or another. And I think Varela, Rosch, and Thompson, and Varela and Maturana, I think they got this idea that it's biology, basically, yeah, the living system. And I include here the ecosystems as living systems, not just individuals, yeah. And we've got to look at that as the sort of the primary point of departure. And the third comment is based on, you mentioned compassion, etc. I'm not familiar with these Eastern traditions, I'm afraid. I hope to get more familiar during the semester with them. But I wonder whether the aesthetic dimension doesn't come in here. And to what extent, this is a question, to what extent Varela and the others take into account the aesthetic dimension in the original Aristotelian sense of sensitivity to the world. A sensitivity to the world in our perception of the world and our reaction to the world, which doesn't pass through knowledge, or doesn't pass through representations. It's more immediate than that. It's more direct than that. We react to the world in order to survive in that world, which brings us back to the question of biology and natural evolution. I mean, they're just some comments. I'm afraid they're not real questions, but thank you very much.
Thank you for the comments / questions. Let me respond with a series of comments to the comments. So the first question about whether we could trace this dichotomy further down the line. So in a certain sense, we could, of course, but there's also something to be said. And by the way, I'm currently reading one of the discoveries of this summer for me was Gasset, this Spanish philosopher. I don't know if you're familiar with him or not, but a very interesting and unfortunately often marginalized figure. But the reason why I'm mentioning it is that he makes a point that even though the modern philosophy is, of course, in many ways rooted in the Greek philosophy and in the overall tradition that was inherited, still this idea of modern subject, which is based on the notion of thought as that which is given to itself, unlike all the other entities in the world, is something that becomes truly articulated and explicated and drawn out in authors such as Descartes and other thinkers that were working at that point. So the split itself in this particular form that I've presented it through these two particular phases or aspects, perspectives, so bifurcation and disenchantment, is something that in many ways is rooted in this particular development that has occurred in modern philosophy. Now, of course, the conditions, the substrate in which this developed was something that has a longer heritage. And there is, of course, much more that can be said. But the main point is that, for example, in the Greek philosophy, all domains of reality were basically conceived of through the lens of thing-likeness. Even the ideas were things, but of a different kind. With Descartes, what you get is you get the domain of mentality, the domain of ego, which is determined by its capacity to think, and thought itself is a completely different breed of species. And for this reason, it kind of...
No, I accept that. I accept that. And I agree totally with you. I was thinking more, actually, less of the self. I was thinking more of the question of instability, because Plato can be read as developing all of his theory in order to try and stabilize what he saw as an unstable world around him. But I agree with you. Yeah, I agree with your point on the question of the self and the mind, yes.
Now, with regards to the last comment that you made, aesthetics, one thing that I would point out here is that given what the authors try to do is where they try to expand the notion of cognition to domains which are usually not necessarily conceived of as cognitive in the narrow sense of the term, and they try to rehabilitate our engagements with the world, which are usually either ignored or presented as secondary. There is definitely, in a certain sense, also a rekindling of this aesthesis of the sensual engagement with the world, and basically a revitalization of perception, not merely as something that reacts, but already something that responds, and it responds in a meaningful manner. And this is already deeply integrated, or this is integral to the notion of autonomous systems. Autonomous systems respond to a world with regards to their own dynamics. And you know, this has profound implications, because it opens up a way where you can talk about how different layers, structures of meanings can emerge in the world. Now, the second comment I unfortunately forgot, so maybe if you could just repeat it.
Oh, it was only Dan Dennett when he talked about evolution and the fact we should look at biology and not physics.
Oh yeah, well that's an interesting comment, because in many ways, in one of the talks, I actually I was making, it wasn't a central point that I was making, but I was kind of making that there seems to be an ongoing, that we're witnessing an interesting shift in the world of sciences, where life sciences are coming to the foreground, and the physics, although it's still kind of presented as the queen of all the sciences and all of that, but it's a very elderly queen, a very tired queen, a very confused queen, consequentially, and everybody knows it has a lot of problems. She's grown old, she's kind of no longer particularly clear in the head, all these ideas that it has, but still, okay, it's there. But the life sciences are the one where the vigor is and where the money is also. So, and these usually go hand in hand when it comes to sciences. But the important thing is that now the dynamics, the entities and phenomena that are brought forward by sciences are becoming more important when you think about ontological and epistemological questions, which then changes very much, how we're going to conceive of reality, and so on and so forth. So I think that it's not completely coincidental that there has been an uprising in panpsychistic views, in idealistic views, all of this. So there has been this attempt to kind of rekindle, revitalize these dimensions, which have been, put by wayside. And very often it is done through a biological lens in one way or another. And what the authors of the Embodied Mind, and also, books related to this are doing, is precisely that. They're basically kind of telling you that if you want to have an epistemology, you kind of will have to start developing this on different bases than just, presuppose that there is a world that is pre-structured in a very specific way. It's not as trivial, that this moment of a living cognitive being cannot simply be eradicated. Also, when it comes to a scientist who him or herself is also a living cognitive being. So the models that she or he constructs, develops, are also kind of related to this fact. So, this can go in a lot of different directions, but there is a very interesting shift where life sciences are kind of seemingly gaining in popularity and prominence in different levels within the scientific domain.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks both for that. So we've certainly time, hopefully, for two more questions, Hamden. I'll let you get back in, hopefully, if the following two are sufficiently brief, but we'll see how we go with that. Atul, you're up next.
Hi, Sebastian. Thank you for the rich, comprehensive presentation. So my question is about the notion of representation and the associated metaphor of the mind as a mirror of nature. So as far as I feel, the notion, the metaphor of a mirror captures something quite intuitive about perception. Like, say I have a cup here and I place 10 mirrors around it. Each mirror will reflect the cup, but will not be the cup. And there will be a relation between them where it's doubled, but it's not the same. So I feel like the metaphor of a mirror does get something quite right. So my question then is, do you think that moving forward, we have to insist on abandoning this idea of representation altogether? Or is it possible to revise it, to maybe infuse it with a more non-dual understanding, to conceive of it as a fleshy mirror, where the representation isn't taken together with these metaphysical presuppositions of a subject-object split, but incorporates the idea of an intertwining, and that we can carry the idea of representation forward in this way? Now, I'm aware that there are other lacks to the idea, like the idea of representation lacks a motor component to an extent, and the sensory motor entanglement is a bit missing there. But if we leave that aside for a moment, do you think there's still something of value in the idea of representation moving forward if we revise it adequately?
So yes, I actually do. Several layers to this. I'll try to keep it brief so that we have time for the other question as well. But one of the things to be said here is I think that one of the great values of this particular book and also the developments that have ensued is to question this notion that representation or basically the representing is the fundamental way of how living beings or cognitive beings engage with the world. So this, I think, was a valuable contribution in the sense of there is something problematic there. However, on the other hand, the representing, both in terms of imaging and both in terms of mirroring or what have you, is something that is very, very strongly and intimately associated with how humans cognize in one way or another. And I think that the problem is that representation has acquired a very specific meaning within the milieu of cognitive science, and this is rooted in what I've tried to also portray briefly in how modern philosophy developed and how it accounted for mind and its relationship to nature. Now, I think that one possible approach is, of course, that you simply throw the representation overboard and say, this is not okay. The other one, I think more fruitful one, the one that you are kind of also hinting at, is to say that there can be something of merit to representation, but I first really have to understand the dynamics of life before I can then properly understand the dynamics of mind more narrowly construed in the domain of the human beings. And I think that once you do this, you can come to the domain, you can come to a more fleshier, like you said, more dynamic, more an active conception of representation that could be useful. And I think that, there's been an ongoing debate within an activist community whether there are minimal representations and so on and so forth. But I have issues with this particular debate because they're kind of, I wouldn't say they're talking past each other, but the problem is there's an attempt to rehabilitate some form of representation in this classical conception and just minimize it, yeah? Whereas, like you said, the idea is to try to figure out what would representation mean if you have a linguistic symbolic being that is human being. But in order for you to be able to get there, you really have to be able to understand properly the dynamic and nature of life before you can talk about mindedness in this symbolic linguistic term. And for example, the work that's been done, very fragmentary, by Maturana and Francisco on languaging and the introduction of language, this could be an interesting segue into it. But unfortunately, enactivism has its own Hicsud dracones already. So representation is now one of them. Yeah? You're not a representationalist if you're an activist. So this is a hindrance, in my opinion. It can hinder a productive debate about this topic. So my answer to your question would be yes, a flashier conception of representation when it comes to human cognition is definitely would be definitely worthwhile and useful in this particular discussion and in tackling these topics.
Thank you. Can I just add a very small follow-up to that? Because you mentioned that it's human cognition and linguistic domain and the symbolic domain. So would you say representation only has validity on that level and not at a more basic perceptual level?
Yes, I would say that that's the case.
Okay. Yes.
Love the brevity and clarity in that second one there. Let's go for that. So, Hong, you are potentially the last question. We'll see how we go with that.
Thanks for the presentation. I'm just thinking about the mentioning of mystical experiences in the beginning. And there seems to be almost inherently this aspect of transcendence in the inactive approach. And this kind of in-betweenness seems to be present in several understanding of what sort of mystical experiences are. So on one aspect, you have some kind of connection to the transcendent or something that's almost absolute. And then on the other hand, you have something well, like the connection is almost groundless, or it's not really a thing or any kind of entity. So yeah, I don't have a specific question in mind, but just thinking about, whether there's a way of understanding mystical experiences from the inactive approach.
Yeah, so from the inactive approach, the thing that you pointed out was precisely this. So the capacity to live the in-betweenness would be something that is integral to the mystical path. The mystical path in this particular way would be the way of self-abnegation or self-transcendence, in the sense of being able to position yourself in this dynamic flux where both you and the world are born. Yeah, and it is something that is, in a certain sense, both transcendent because it's out of your normal self, but it's also immanent because it's something that runs in and through you, so to speak. So basically, a mystic from the inactive perspective would be someone who would be interested not so much in necessarily conceptualizing this debate within a very specific philosophical framework within which the questions of the mind and cognition have developed, but someone who would try to find ways to cultivate modes of living which would allow him or her to position him or herself in this in-betweenness, so to speak. Yeah, in this field of co-emergence, so this ongoing pulsation. And of course, then the question would, from the inactivist perspective, then there would be some defense of this so-called perennialist thesis. So within the field of mysticism, there's this question whether each religious tradition has a very specific type of religious experience or mystical experience, which is determined by the cultural and social background within which it developed, or whether there are experiences which transcend these conditionings. From an activist perspective, there would be these types of experiences, but they would be precisely related to this groundlessness. However, as soon as you would try to articulate it or do something with it, you would have to kind of position yourself in the domain of symbolic, in the specific framework of language that is familiar to you, so that you can make sense of it. Not you only to yourself, I mean, not so much necessarily to yourself or also to yourself, but also to others. Yeah. So I don't know, does this at least somewhat address the topic that you've raised?
Yeah, I think it's something that I've been thinking about for a long time. So thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Superb, thank you. So a delightful example there of the value of just asking the question and or making the comment. We are very much sort of pro comment and pro half-formed thought, although I think there was a bit more half-formed, more than half-formed there in both the question and the response. But getting the discussion alive through that, absolutely in favor of that, and please do throw out half-formed ideas or just vague questions if you do have them. So I read we've got about 2 minutes left. So how quick do you think you can be? And similarly in the response, Sebastian. So I'll
do my best.
Challenge you both to get this last question in.
I'll also do my best. Okay, so I was gonna reply to Mr. Benel when he said that Dennett made this point about how we've been focusing too much on biology, on physics rather than biology. And I really see a problem with this thought, because once we still allow physics to be conceived in this old way, as this old queen, like Sebastian said, then it doesn't really matter what we do with biology, because we will always subsume it under physics in the end. So it might seem to us this will be the old argument that the physicists or physicalists have used for a very long time. It only seems to us like we are free and so on, but ultimately this rule, this law of everything, which is physics, or which would fall under physics, must subsume it. So in this regard, I also thought there's like a maybe solution in terms of the question of representationalism, or how we can keep conceiving ourselves as mirrors, like this point that Sebastian mentioned about how we see ourselves as mirrors of reality. Once we see the reality itself as just a mirror, right? Like when we adapt this idea of autonomous systems to all of reality, to the whole of reality, then us being a mirror of just another mirror doesn't provide it's not an issue anymore. It's not a problem anymore. So I wanted to know what Sebastian would say to this idea.
Well, we don't have much time, so I will try to keep this brief. I will just say the following. I've just ended reading autobiography of one of the greatest mystics from the Christian tradition, Saint Teresa de Avila. And towards the end of the book, what she says was that, she's describing several visions that she had, and at some point she had a vision as to how God sees everything. So, in a certain sense, like a deitic gnosis. So, what is a gnosis of the from the in the God realm? And basically, the way she describes it is by using two interrelated examples. One is the example of the mirror. So where basically you have a huge mirror where all the different aspects mirror each other. And the other aspect is like a huge crystal, but you have something similar. So in both of these conceptions, you have like this ongoing fractal structure, where each segment, in a certain sense, captures and mirrors everything else. So I'm not going to comment on this. I'm just putting this out there. This is what Saint Teresa is saying in this particular book. So we had a question about mysticism. We had Hamdin talking about the crystal and about the mirrors. So maybe we can end on this note. Yeah, the world being this huge mirror and huge crystal where everything is kind of mirroring each other.
And certainly a productive and very positive note to finish. And in fact, the discussion can indeed refract, recurs, and continue on the Slack also. So this sounds like a potentially useful seed to kick things off there. So for those, I think everyone, or pretty much everyone, has joined the Slack group at this point. So do please feel free to throw a few comments and/or questions in there over the course of the next few weeks. So that brings us to the end for this week. We will be taking up in 2 weeks' time. Oh, I tell you what, I'll brief. Do you want to just jump in there, Joanna?
No, please. If you want to talk about the next session, that'd be great, and I can talk about Hannah's talk tomorrow.
So yeah, I was just going to mention just very quickly that Varela Bonadel will bring us to the point where the term really gets fleshed out and put into practice in chapter 8. So this is as it were, one of the points that we've been leading up through over the whole course of the previous semester, and now as we had our sort of superb lead in for tonight. So that'll be in 2 weeks' time. And certainly, if you have an opportunity to listen to Hannah tomorrow, I would certainly take that opportunity as well. So the links, sorry, Joanna, the links are available on the website, is that right?
Yeah, more information is available on the website. Yeah. So the talk tomorrow with Hannah de Jager is actually for the MLE friends. So if you're not yet a part of that community, feel free to join. And she's giving actually a talk which will reveal some of her new thinking specifically about how Enaction can live in the in-between space between theory and practice. So it's somewhat of an extension of what we've been talking about today, and it could be interesting, I think, to a lot of people here. So feel free to join if you're able. And if not, we'll see you all back in 2 weeks, as Marek said. And once again, feel free to take advantage of the Slack space. It's there for your using. So have a great evening, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. We'll see you in a couple of
Thanks,
weeks.
everyone, for attending.
Thank you.